Based on your time in the Kremlin circles, is there a plan B for when Putin is gone?
Well, I don't think there is a plan B. I mean, I think back in 2000 when Putin was sort of sniffing around to find ways whether he could leave office, I think he found he couldn't leave office because of probably the threat to his personal security and his position. And that's why he rigged the constitution in 2020. That's why he can now stay till 2036. That's why he dealt with the political opposition. Navalny shut down NGOs, clamped down on the final bits of the independent media, both online and print and radio. And here we are, 6 years later, after 4 years of war, he is at the centre of power. There is no opposition inside Russia. He's dealt with any people who've popped up over the last 4 years who've challenged him. Navalny's been murdered. Prigozhin was blown up visibly. So I think everybody expects that he is going to leave in a box. Now, whether he leaves in a box due to old age, I mean, he's quite young, but he's still, he's living into his 80s. Looks fairly healthy to me. Or whether he's bumped off. I don't think it's a planned transition. And of course, we've got no Dauphin has been, no pretender, no heir apparent has been nominated. So I think what's happening is the system is just clogged up, waiting for whatever happens to Putin in due course. And I think that's the most likely scenario. And I don't think that somebody's going to be moving against him.
Whenever Putin is challenged by journalists on the Ukraine war, he writes the question down and then launches into a lecture on Russian history and NATO expansion being the root cause. Isn't that just all part of Russia's strategy for using information as a weapon? So misinformation.
Well, I think the real thing is he actually believes this stuff. He's sort of everybody's favourite autodidactic historian who sits in a room and gets the books out and spews forth with strange history lessons which he's come up with in isolation or alone in his dacha or in his bunker. I mean, it's not just about Ukraine. We all read that bizarre 5,000 word or 10,000 word essay on Ukraine and how Ukraine was part of Russia. But he's also done things on World War II, about the causes of World War II and Russians, history wars about how Russia's been constrained by the West, how Russia stood firm against the Tartar menace and provided a shield to Europe. So this sort of weird use of history has features for a long time. I don't think it's just related to the war. I mean, what's clear is, though, that he believes it. Secondly, that history matters because they're now forcing one version of state history across schools and universities, and 7-year-olds are now getting history lessons. That this sort of warped view of Russia's history is being used to try and form a new cadre of true believers when Putin goes, to try part of his legacy. But unfortunately, I think, railing against the West, railing against NATO, railing against Ukraine, railing against the British is popular. And Putin's it's popular inside Russia. It's also popular in some quarters in the West. And I think it is used to try and convince it's part of the hearts and minds battle to convince people that Russia's on the right side of history and that the West and Ukraine are on the wrong side.
So you've dealt with people like Dmitry Peskov and been up close to those sorts of people. In the West, we see them as polished mouthpieces, quite calm. But when you're up close to them, are they true believers or are they themselves terrified employees and they're just trying to survive?
Well, I mean, I have met Peskov at a reception, and he was very charming and polite, but that's his job, is to be charming and polite. I mean, one thing I always say to people is you should pay attention to what he says, because obviously he has direct access to the boss. Others don't. Others like Lavrov I don't pay much attention to, because the foreign ministry and he are very much just a mouthpiece. But Peskov has more insight. I mean, I met Shoigu in particular before the invasion, and we were talking about the war and the causes, the build up to the war, and not to invade and how it'd be mad. And what was interesting for me is how emotional Shoigu was in person, how he had regurgitated the narrative about, quote, Ukrainian genocide in the Donbass, and how he had historic Ukrainian links, that they were one people. And he actually started to choke up, and he got some tears in his eyes. And later in a one-on-one meeting with Ben Wallace, apparently there were tears. So just because we think it's mad, and this sort of narrative of war and the build-up to the war, doesn't mean that the Russians and some of the Russian people in the state think it's mad. They think it's logical from their point of reference. And if that's the case, then we have to deal with Russia as it is, not as we wish it to be. And if you think about the causes of the war, whether that's subjugating Ukraine, whether that's part of legacy, whether that's pushing back against the West's historic period of policy of containment, none of those war goals have been fulfilled, and that's why I think the fighting will continue.
We're seeing the launch of Russia's big spring-summer offensive right now, and we're seeing the same nightmarish meat wave tactics. Do you think this is a lack of imagination, or is mass high attrition the only tool the Russian military actually knows how to use?
I don't think we've seen the spring offensives properly start. I think we're in that transition from winter into summer. I mean, the Ukraine has a very short spring and a very short autumn between long periods of heat and long periods of snow. So the situation is changing on the ground because of the advent of spring, and trees start to sprout leaves and everything becomes green. It provides greater cover. So I think over the winter, as I predicted, the fighting continued at a low level. Ukraine made some advances back against Russian pressing over the last year or 2 years. But I think we'll have to see now how Russia continues in 2026. I still think Russia's money and its men and its material advantage outweigh those Ukrainians. But perhaps the balance will be slightly redressed by Ukrainians this year. But I think since 2022, when Russia tried to do a shock and awe campaign against Kyiv and seize it within a period of weeks and months, they pivoted then to an attritional campaign. That's where we've been. And unfortunately, in attrition, mass matters. And fundamentally, Russia's bigger than Ukraine. So on the tactics, what's also been clear is, given the advent of drones and unmanned systems, is that mass armoured attacks in the old Russian Soviet style are likely to be unsuccessful, and instead they've come to these infiltration tactics, which have proven successful and have allowed Russia to advance, albeit at huge cost. So I suspect that's going to be the way they do it, because that's the way they've worked out is the best way of doing it for them, and because they've got sort of reasonable flow of people to fill the ranks despite the costs.
So Ukraine's primary target is to keep the Russian casualties above their monthly recruitment rate. Is this on track, and can we predict an ending to this war?
I mean, I think there was lots of news in sort of January, February saying that Russia's finally tipped over, the casualties exceed recruitment. But as then Russian writers pointed out, that in some ways that was bookkeeping. The numbers have gone up because bookkeeping in 2020 of lost casualties in 2022-23 are finally being brought onto the books, or say, of the losses, because of bureaucratic delays inside Russia. So again, is Russia struggling to fill the ranks? No. One indicator is how much they pay people to join up, and that when they're struggling, that goes up, or when they're finding it easy, it goes down. It's ticked up, but it hasn't gone up significantly. And certainly, Russian experts I read say that Russia has sufficient manpower. It doesn't mean it's going to be able to have like a glut, but it has enough to do what it needs to do. And it probably means it has to focus its effort on the main effort, which is Donbass, and is unable to attack along the whole front. So the more people they have, the wider the front, the less people they have, the narrower the front. But I don't think we should assume that Russia's running out of manpower, because the way the demographics work, Russia's churning out several 100,000 younger people who can go as conscripts and then release people in the regular army to the front, and also people, because the economic turndown, want to volunteer. So I'm always a bit wary to say that there's light at the end of the tunnel here. I mean, I think Ukraine does need to keep upping the kill rate, but ultimately this will be settled politically, and it won't be casualties which will make Putin change course. It's economic damage, and that will probably be done wider than just Ukraine's done due to sanctions.
So those Russian recruits, we're seeing reports on the battlefield of barrier troops killing soldiers who are retreating. This feels less like a modern 21st century army and more like the Red Army in 1942. From your time observing their command structure, is this brutality a sign of desperation because the offensive is stalling, or is this the fundamental DNA of the Russian military?
Yeah, I mean, we know the discipline has been pretty bad for a number of years. And I think I wrote in The Economist that one Russian expert told me that the Russian army is less than an army, more of a militia, especially when you see it on the ground now. You know, the ragtag sort of Mad Max army, or motorcycles and people on bicycles and quad bikes, is a long way from where we were 4 years ago, with lots of tanks and armour and manoeuvre. And I think brutality isn't a symptom of a problem. It's fundamentally systematic in the Russian army. They've always dealt with people, their own, and the enemy with exceptional brutality going back hundreds of years. But given the problems of discipline and the tactics being used and the complete callousness of leaders, commanders towards their men, it's not surprising there's barrier troops. But I think what's also interesting is, despite the terrible morale, the terrible leadership, the huge casualties, A, people are still joining up, and B, there hasn't been large-scale desertions. Again, if you're joining the Russian army as a volunteer, now your chances of being killed are very high, but also there is a possibility of coming out of that with huge wealth, generational wealth, and setting yourself up and your family up for decades. So I think that's probably one of the calculations, to say, look, we know it's terrible, but there is that glimmer of chance that I might be able to pull through. Of course, the more the Ukrainians kill, then the less that gamble, should we say, that bet pays off for you.
That sort of generational wealth idea, what would that look like? Would that be being the toughest, meanest, most corrupt soldier wins kind of scenario?
I think it's more, if you're, when I was in Russia, we travelled out to the Far East on the train, and we stopped off at places called like Buryatia, which is east of the Lake Baikal. And a lot there is grindingly poor, but they've always, because of the way that Stalin gave them sort of state nationhood, been quite loyal to the Russian state, and also provided lots of soldiers. And when we're looking at the figures about how much you get paid if you get killed, I got my Russian assistant to look at being killed or injured compensation, which has only gone up, and you translated that across into purchasing power in places like Buryatia. This is a chance to buy yourself a farm, to buy your parents' houses, and to be able to hand that down. So leaving a dead-end job where the future is menial work or alcoholism through to a proper life is, that's a draw is quite high. So that's why I think the Kremlin's been quite careful at targeting poor areas, because Russia is not Moscow and St. Petersburg. A lot of it is grindingly poor with terrible life chances. If you're in that position, who are we to say, these people shouldn't join up? Of course they're going to join up, because there is that possibility of you coming back, quote, being a hero and quote, being rich.
Just how much of what we see today is the ghost of the Soviet Union? So the tanks from the 60s, the rigid hierarchy. Has the Russian military actually modernized, or is the corruption so rampant it's incapable?
Well, I think every armed forces is a reflection of the society for which it's drawn. I mean, there's reason why the British armed forces look like they do, and the reason the German armed forces do, and there's reasons the Russian armed forces do, and how they resemble their Soviet and imperial predecessors. And that's something the current regime has played on. At those parades over Red Square in May, you get Tsarist tropes, Soviet tropes, and modern Russian is all sort of mixed together. But I think it's fair to say it is, dominated by the army, highly conservative, normally focused on quantity and hierarchy, certainly not one to delegate your responsibility downwards. And I think the way the Russian army has performed over the last 4 years, it's shown a continual drift back, shall we say, back to the past, back towards its sort of core roots, away from innovation and initiative and modernity, back towards how things have always been, more back towards divisions and corps away from brigades. So you can see this playing out. And I think the problem is that Putin's tried to reform his army twice already since he's in power. Once to become, quote, joined to a modern one, to start the transition back towards tradition, and is now facing a third wave of quote, modernisation or reconstruction. But I think they might be able to reconstruct the kit, re-equip it, but I don't think they've worked out what sort of army they want next. And the most likely army they get next is going to be pretty traditional conservative, because that's the mood of the country. Insularity, going back to basics.
We're seeing a cat and mouse race with drones and AI on the front lines. Based on your insight into both cultures, who's winning the race to innovate? Is it the Ukrainian garage startups or the Russian state-run industrial complex?
I think you've got sort of two competing approaches. As you said, the Ukrainians are very inventive, but find it hard to scale up and across. And the Russians are less inventive, but they're quite easy. They're quite good at scaling up and making sure that everybody has the same kit. So I think you've seen this sort of, after Ukraine started very strongly and very innovatively, and then the Russians are caught up. I mean, before the war, I used to go to these arms shows and take pictures of drones to send back to London, and they were always sort of stuck out in the corner. The drones were like, yeah, that's fantastic, look at our tank. But then the drones are caught up by necessity, both by industrial production, also by sort of, they call it the civilian military complex, private companies stepping in. And then what you have is then a reaction by the Ukrainians to that. And I saw some Russian analysis saying that the Ukrainians are ahead, certainly on sort of heavier, longer range drones with innovation and use of tech and a spiral of generations. But I expect the Russians will catch up. But I think if you step back even more widely, I think we're only at the foothills of the drone revolution, which has been played out in the last 4 years. There's an awful long way to go in the utility and capabilities of these drones, and therefore, how does that affect modern armies, including the British Army? If you have this impossibility of moving on the ground, then what's your reaction?
Do you think Putin will get more desperate? Do you think there would ever be, do you think the nuclear option would ever be bandied about, or is that, China wouldn't allow that?
Yeah, we've had a few, moments of nuclear signalling. A lot of that's to do with when Russia's under pressure, I think, when it's being forced into peace talks, it doesn't want to do, or whether, it's having a reverse on the battlefield. That's to throw a dead atomic cat on the table, just so everybody goes, oh my God, the nuclear option. I think the chances of nuclear use in Ukraine remain remote. They're probably not as remote as they were at the beginning of the war. But as you said, the Americans and the Chinese, I think, make quite clear the consequences to Russia and Putin in particular if they use nuclear weapons. But I think in terms of escalation, I think there is further Putin can go. They're spending about 8 to 10% of the GDP on defence. So the British spent 50% of our GDP on defence in 1944, and the Soviets about 40%. So you can grind an awful lot more money out of the system. And 2, on manpower, I think Russia could grind more people out of the system to use in the front as well. They could mobilise. I mean, maybe not. I don't think it's likely, but they could. Or they could call up more reserves to swell the ranks. So I think Russia has the escalatory options there. And I think the third one would be to really go after the cities, the Ukrainian cities, to try and break morale. They're not just by drones, but by missile strikes, and continue their campaign to try and break the Ukrainian people. So far they haven't been able to do that, but as we've seen them this week, Russia has no compunction of targeting historic city centres.
Is the contrast between Zelensky's decentralized NATO-style command and Putin's Tsar-style top-down control the reason Russia hasn't won yet?
But the question is, what's the roots of the Russian military failure? I mean, I think they overestimated themselves. They politicised intelligence and didn't get a clear picture of the Ukrainian military. They underestimated the Ukrainians, they underestimated Western support. And it turned out the Russian army wasn't much good, because it's quite good at marching across Red Square, goose-stepping its way across Red Square, but not very good at fighting and adapting. And it turned out to be quite rigid, so they didn't have a plan B or C or D when plan A didn't work. So I think Ukrainian ingenuity, decentralisation, mission command certainly has worked for them at the early stages. But I think what you're seeing now is actually more rigour being brought to the Ukrainian assistance, including by the new defence minister, corps and divisions, trying to sort out systemic equipment and manpower problems. So maybe in some ways the Ukrainians have become a little bit more Russian, and then the Russians have become a little more Ukrainian, because they've also trying to encourage younger junior leaders to take decisions themselves. But I think on the Russian side, again, the army reflects society. If you have a very top-down, rigid society with decisions being taken by a small group of people, that doesn't encourage your generals and your officers and men to take the initiative. And that's probably actively discouraged. What we've seen is people who step out the way of the status quo, the way we do things, tend to get removed, including generals at the front, those who are argumentative or complain about the way the general staff is doing. And in the middle, you've got people like Gerasimov, who is is an administrator and a yes man, not a war leader.
If we go back to February 2022, what did you see and hear in the meeting rooms you were in? Did you see the invasion happening? Did you detect generals were lying through their teeth, the Russian generals?
Yeah, I mean, I thought they were going to do it from November onwards. I was on the more pessimistic side. There were still optimists who thought this is all going to blow over. This is just a big ploy to gain concessions out of NATO and the United States. But my view was, as it got closer and closer, you saw this stuff pile up, plus other information, it was becoming more likely than not they were going to do it. So we sort of marched up the probability chain. But in February 22, just before the invasion, Gerasimov still tried to say, well, we have no intention of attacking Ukraine. And then Admiral Radakin said to him, well, if that's the case, why have we got 150,000 troops on the border? And Gerasimov didn't say anything. So I think by that stage, we were pretty certain they were going to do it. And then the meeting probably confirmed it. The motion from Shoigu, the sort of lies, barefaced lies from the top of the leadership, the military. And that was why Britain in particular doubled down on sending arms to Ukraine and tried to redouble its effort to get Europe, Germany, France, Italy to take the invasion more seriously.
One of the striking elements to Russian society is the scale of corruption. Can you give us an example of this in your experience?
And on both sides, I can give you an example. When Yanukovych came to power in 2010, and did a deal with the Russians over the Black Sea Fleet, he was paid a personal bribe. I've heard figures of $100 million just to say thank you. And I think when we in the West talk about corruption, we had this sort of MP's corruption scandal, which is very, very small beer. The scale of corruption inside Russia, it would shock everybody. And I think it comes down at all levels, about having to pay bribes or hurry up money to get yourself from one place in the queue to another. And it's how the system, it's like there's a grease of the system. Without payments, the system would clog up. So I know that officers pay their way onto courses to become advanced. I know that families save up money to get positions in the tax administrations, therefore to be able to divert more money to their own pockets. We know that Shoigu, the former defence minister, and his crew were systematically looting the Russian Ministry of Defence of money which should have gone to the front. So I think Putin's patience finally snapped. And that's why you've seen those group of ministers around Shoigu, former defence minister, being sent to prison or fired. So this has real world consequences. Russia has slid down the tables of the anti-corruption tables, the probity table, gone further and further, become more and more corrupt. And in some ways, actually, Ukraine's always meant to be called the most corrupt country in the world. Ukraine's gone the other way because of the rigours of war and also public expectation, also the guardrails provided by the European Union, that you have to deal with this. It's unpatriotic in Ukraine to be corrupt, and that's why people who are seen to be corrupt, like Yermak, the former head of the presidential administration, was sacked. Had to be sacked to be seen to do the right thing. So you're getting very competing views. Ukraine is not Russia, which some people make the mistake of saying. They're both very, very different societies.
Casting our minds back to 1999, can you talk a little bit about how Putin came to power, and were there warning signs the West didn't take notice of?
I was serving the Navy when the Cold War finished, and it was a great sort of deep sigh of relief, certainly in the West. Russia, we hadn't gone to war, there had been nuclear war, and there was a new opportunity. I was in Russia in 1991 as an interpreter, and this huge sense of optimism that Russia's going to be given this historic chance, this moment. Russia now can emerge to its final place as a normal country in Europe. So I think there was a lot of over-optimism on our part, but I think Putin rose because of the waste of that historic chance under Yeltsin in the 1990s, and the systemic collapse, the turmoil of the 1990s. I don't think there was a great plot to put him, by the mafia or the FSB, on the throne in 1999. I think he was an accidental president. Yeltsin and his family, the family of oligarchs and politicians and family members, looked for somebody who would keep them alive, preserve their wealth, and sort of maintain Russia's destiny as a great power. And they looked at various candidates, and they happened upon Putin, who at the time was seen as a good administrator, a safe pair of hands, as a liberal Democrat. Turns out they made a massive error. As Alexei Navalny said, they let the goat into the cabbage patch. And what the goat's mission is to eat cabbage. And Putin ate all the cabbage. And as Navalny said, they built, instead of democracy and liberalism, Putin built a huge prison, imprisoned everyone he disagrees with, and then him and his crew stole everything. So Yeltsin, I've become clear on, he's at the root of the failure of Russian democracy. The self-coup in 93, the rigged elections in 96, trying to preserve his family's influence, moving away from democracy, plus his ill health, and Kosovo, I think, also played a part. The war of Kosovo all came together. Putin was chosen, and once he was in, you couldn't get him out. 26 years later, he's still there eating cabbage.
Can you talk a little about his psyche and his personality? Is he just a psychopath?
No, I think that's a mistake. I don't think we should be. I think people say Putin's insane, but I don't think that's useful. I think he's logical, but within his own frame of reference, given all the nature and nurture stuff. And one thing, before the war came about, various leaders would talk to him on the phone, and then they would all share the notes. And I'd sit there reading the notes about Macron or whoever the German Chancellor was, and Boris. And actually, they all said he was rational. They didn't agree with him, but they thought he was rational. I think his personality is, fundamentally he's a nationalist, an aggressive Russian nationalist. I think he believes himself as a part of a wider historic frame, to be amongst the pantheons of great Russian leaders who brought Russia together and stabilised it, turned it back into great power. I think he's totally without remorse or pity, as we've seen how he's dealt with people over the last 26 years. I also think he's incompetent. He's actually, solidified power, concentrated in his own hands, but Russia is no greater than it was when he came to power. It's become poorer, less stable, rather than the sort of stability narrative he puts about. I think he doesn't trust anybody at all. The people he has around him are there to reflect glory back onto him and to, do what he wants them to do. He doesn't broker opposition, and I think actually he's got worse over the years. As somebody said, I think Mark Galeotti said, if he'd left in sort of 2008 before he handed over to Medvedev, he'd be seen as a great stabilising figure. But because he stayed on, came back, crushed the Bolotnaya protests, annexed Crimea, started war in the Donbass, clamped down on freedoms, crushed Russian democracy, then invaded Ukraine. Actually, I think his legacy is in jeopardy. So he probably, like everybody, stayed too long, and now he's victim of his own PR. That he believes himself to be a great figure. He can't change course, and as I said, he'll be there until he's taken out in a box.
How do you see this war ending? We know Russia's maximalist demands. What's going to happen there in another 4 or 5 years' time?
I think I said in 2024 there was a chance under Trump of a settlement. The Biden administration was quite happy just to sort of keep it going. Didn't really matter. Escalation management. But Trump said, we're going to end it. And I've had some very ups and downs on the diplomatic track, but they're still talking off camera. But I think, so there's a chance of peace. It will only be settled at the negotiation table. It won't be settled on the battlefield. I don't think either side can strategically defeat the other. And that's been the lesson of the last 3.5 years, at least, maybe 4 years now. That sort of defensive side can't gain an advantage over the defensive side. And then when Ukraine trying to push against the Russians, it doesn't work vice versa. So you end up in this sort of war of hundreds of meters. Putin talks about great victories, but if you look on the ground, nothing's really much has changed for years. What brings Russia to the negotiating table? I think it's economics. And I think there was a chance there is a chance of severe economic damage changing Putin's calculation. This current war in Iran has probably eased the pressure slightly, but it hasn't changed the fundamentals. The Russian economy is in the dogs, under severe pressure and getting worse. The question, of course, is whether the United States, and particularly Trump, is prepared to really bring the hammer down on the Russian economy at the same time as keeping Ukraine in the fight and keeping Ukraine armed as politically and economically supported. So unfortunately, I think given the sort of back and forth of 2025, the scenario is a longer drawn out conflict, but there is still a chance of peace, and I think it will require compromise on both sides for the short term. For the long term, without security guarantees, there's nothing to stop Russia re-attacking at some stage in the future. So it can't just be a peace thing. Peace, thank God, for goodness sake, we've got peace. It has to be both just, which the Prime Minister says, and sustainable. Without sustainability, then we'll be back there in 3 or 4 years' time.
And is there any chance of Ukraine joining NATO now?
No, I think there's no consensus in the alliance about the members, and also I think the Ukrainians realise that as well. So the more likely scenario is the heavily armed, fortified Ukraine for the foreseeable future. I think European Union membership is possibly more likely, but as that becomes closer, Europeans are starting to sort of bump their gums and chew their lips about whether to do that, and whether what was signed up to, this accelerated track towards membership, actually follows through, because I think inside the European Union there are also opponents to that, because of particularly on economics and workers. So the Americans put European Union membership in their negotiating position. I think Russia would be happy with that, but whether the Europeans come through and deliver remains to be seen.